Hey guys, in this lesson, I want to go over this concept of destructuring. So destructuring objects, destructuring arrays, and the goal of this lesson is to really make it clear in your mind how destructuring works in JavaScript ES6 and get really used to the syntax. Now, if you're already pretty familiar with this concept of destructuring and you've already used it and you have no problems using it at all, then feel free to simply just complete the challenge. And if you can complete it without any problems, then feel free to skip this lesson. So the idea is to uncomment all of the code below the challenge line. And what we want to happen is to render the stats that come from our practice.js file, where there's a constant called cars. And this is a relatively complex structure. It's an array with two objects. Inside the object, there's other nested objects, and there's also other nested arrays. So the idea is to not change any of this code here and try to use these names of variables to make this work by destructuring the code from our practice.js file. Here's what you should be able to achieve once you complete the challenge. We have this table over here with the brands, the top speed, and the top color. And all of this data is being pulled out from our cars array. The model corresponds to this first column, and then the top speed corresponds to this property top speed, and the top color is the first color in the array. Now, don't worry if you see these errors in the console. It's not related to any of your code. It's to do with how we're structuring our HTML table that React doesn't like. But I wanted to keep the table simple so we can focus on destructuring. So the idea is to make the errors go away without touching any of the existing code and just adding some code right here to destructure the array inside practice.js. And if you can complete this without problems, then I'm happy for you to skip this lesson. But if you are not sure where to start, or if you get stuck during the challenge, then I recommend watching this video where I'm going to dive deeper into how to destructure nested arrays, how to provide default values, and all of that. So let's get started by forking a copy of the starting sandbox. And to start off, I'm actually going to ignore this entire challenge, and I'm just going to make some space for myself inside the index.js. And we're not going to be working with the practice.js data yet. We're going to start off using this file called data.js. And I want to quickly reiterate some of the things I spoke about when I first introduced you to this concept of destructuring. So here we have an array called animals, and it has two objects as the first and second items. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to export this animals as the default export, and then I'm going to import it into my index.js. All right, so I'm pulling animals, that array, in from my file data. And now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to log what animals looks like, because this is probably what you're going to be doing when you're looking at data that's coming from another provider, say an API or some sort of module or some sort of framework like React. So we notice that we've got two objects. One is a cat and one is a dog. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to destructure this array of animals into a variable so that I can hold the first object in a variable called cat and the second object in a variable called dog. So if you want to give that a go, pause the video now. All right, so in order to destructure this, I'm going to create a new constant. And because I'm destructuring an array, the variable names go inside an array literal, like this, so 2 square brackets. Now, the first item in that animals array, if we remember, was a cat, and the second was a dog. So I'm going to set these as the names of the first item and the second item from this animals array. So now what my code has done is it's reached inside this array of animals, pulled out the first item and assigned it a name of cat, pulled out a second item and assigned it a name of dog. If I decide to log the value of cat, you can see it is just a single object with two properties. So I've freed it from the array effectively. And this is pretty much the same as saying var cat equals animals at index 0. It does exactly the same thing, but obviously in a much more concise kind of syntax. The other thing to remember is that when you destructure anything, say an array or an object, into separate variable names, these names need to be unique inside your file. So, for example, you can't destructure this animals array and pull out something to be held inside a variable called cat and then create another variable called cat. You'll get an error saying that identify cat has already been used and declared. So these names, when you destructure, must be unique. So now that we've destructured our array, let's think about how we can destructure an object. So we know that our cat is now pulled out of animals and it is in fact an object, right? So if we wanted to destructure this object, how would we go about it? Well, the syntax is very similar, but this time, because we're destructuring an object, we're going to create an object literal using a set of curly braces instead. And inside these curly braces, we can pull out any of the properties that we want from the object. So we know that the cat object has two properties. One's called name and the other one's called sound. So if we wanted to, we can pull out both of these properties, name and sound, and get it out of that cat object. Now we have a variable called name and a variable called sound, which is equivalent to cat.name and cat.sound. And if I decide to log the value of, say, sound, you can see that I get the word meow being printed out. And this provides us a lot of convenience because going from this original array of animals, in order to get this sound meow logged, we would have had to say animals at index 0 dot sound. And we would have to do this every single time we needed the value inside this property. But remember that there's a crucial difference when you're destructuring objects versus arrays. Notice how in the array, we could have basically called each of these destructured variables any name we wanted. I could have called this C and called this D, and I decide to log C. Notice how it is still going to log cat. But when you destructure an object, these names that are going inside here have to match with the property names of that object. This way it knows which one to actually pull out. So these have to be the same as the keys that you see here. Now notice how if I decide to change this to animal sound instead of sound, which is what it's actually called, this no longer works and it prints undefined because it looks inside this object, tries to find the value for this key animal sound, and clearly there is no key called animal sound, so this comes back as undefined instead. Now, destructuring can be useful for other things as well. For example, if you wanted to actually give these variables a different name to what they were as the properties of the object, you can do that. You can simply add a colon and say this is going to be called cat name and this is going to be called cat sound. So now what happens is you no longer have access to these variable names sound and name. Instead, you've turned it into cat sound, which comes out as meow, and cat name, which comes out as cat. This is a way of providing an alternative name for the properties that come from an object. And this is really useful, especially when you're getting hold of data from public APIs, where you didn't really get the chance to name the properties inside those JSONs. Sometimes they make sense, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're very, very short, and if you wanted to put your own touch, then this is how you might do it. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you is how you would provide a default value. For example, if we were going to destructure our cat object again, and we have our name and our sound set to equal to cat, but I wanted to give name and sound a custom value. How might I do that? Well, you could simply just add in an equal sign. Say name is equal to, let's call it, I don't know, fluffy, and sound is equal to purr. So now what happens when I log name is that it comes out as cat because that is the value for name from this object cat. But if it didn't have a name, let's say we go into the data and I delete the name and I come back, then notice how it's now being printed as fluffy. So this basically says if name is undefined, then use this value instead. And this is also really helpful because sometimes when you're getting data, again, from the internet, a lot of these fields might not be filled. So you don't want your app or your website to just crash. You want to give it some default value so that it will actually get displayed. Now, the final thing I want to show you regarding destructuring objects is what to do when you have a nested object. So let's say that in addition to the properties name and sound, we had another property called feeding requirements. And this property is going to hold its own object. And it has a property called food and another one called water. So let's say that food is 2 times a day and they have to be watered 3 times a day. So in this case, we've now got an object which has an object inside it. So how would we destructure these nested objects? Let's say that I wanted to log the number of times that I have to feed my cat. So I want to be able to log the value of food that lives inside this cat object. Well, we start out with our const, and our cat object, remember, has those two properties, name and sound. So let's go ahead and destructure it down to name and sound. But we've now got an extra one called feeding requirements. So let's add that in here as well. So now let's set it to equal to cat. And if I go ahead and log the value of feeding requirements, you can see that I get this object being logged, right? It's got food and water as properties. Now, I can, if I want to get hold of food, by simply writing feeding requirements dot food, which is our usual syntax. But what if I wanted to get hold of just food by itself without having to use the dot syntax, effectively destructuring it again? How would I do that? Well, you can simply set this feeding requirements, instead of giving it an alternative name, you open up a set of curly braces and you pull out the values inside. So those things were called food and water. So now, if you console log food, you're going to get the number of times that the cat needs to be fed. And this is done through an extensive destructuring. So we got a hold of our object cat, which is this one. We pulled out the feeding requirements object, and then out of that object, we further destructured it. So we had a variable called food, which is set to the value of 2, and water, which is set to the value of 3. Now remember, you can destructure as much or as little as you want. So for example, for our cat, if I only wanted the feeding requirements destructured, then I can do that. You don't have to do it for all of the keys and values inside an object. So hopefully that clears things up a little bit more, and you've got some new ideas of how to destructure arrays and how to destructure objects. So the next thing I want to show you is a little bit about how the setState function might look. If inside our data.js, let's say that we had a function and it was called useAnimals. This sounds like some animal abuse, but it's not. No animals are going to be harmed in this function, but what we are going to do is we're going to accept an animal as an input to this function, and we're going to return an array. This array has two values only. It's going to be the animal.name and a function. So this function is going to console log the animal.sound. So it's going to effectively make the sound, right? Now that we've created this function called useAnimals and it returns an array with two items, one is a string, the name of the animal, and the other is a function which does something. When it's activated, it just makes a sound. Now, if we go ahead and export this function as well, useAnimals, and we go back inside our index.js, we can now import it in the same kind of syntax as we imported our useState, right? By tagging it after the default export, like so. Now, let's say that I decided to use this function called useAnimals and pass my animal object cat inside. Now, if I go ahead and log the value of this useAnimals with cat, then you can see that what gets logged is an array with two items. The first item is the string cat, and the second item is a function. Now that I know that the output of this function is an array, well, I can simply just destructure it, right? So I can create a const, add a set of square brackets to create an array literal. So the first item that goes in here is going to be the name of the first item of the array, which I'll just call animal. And the second item is going to be assigned the value of the function. So I'll call the function make sound. And then I'm going to set it equal to the output of this function useAnimals with cat. Now, if I console log animal, you can see that I'm going to get cat printed out. And if I go ahead and get hold of make sound and I call it, then you'll see it says meow. So this would, I imagine, be very similar to how useState would look. And I hope by deconstructing our own example, you can better understand how that code for useState actually works. So now that you've learned a lot more about destructuring, it's time to complete this challenge. Pause the video now and I'll show you the solution in the next lesson.